It's good to have you back another day here at Christ Table as we are continuing on through this journey of the Gospel of Mark. My name is Kevin Young, and I have the privilege of serving at Christ Table as lead clergy. Now, if you'd like to know more about Christ Table, we would love to fill you in on more about what we do, who we are, who we minister to on the fringes and the margins of faith. You can find out more about us by going to the URL right there, www.christstable.today. There, I would encourage you to sign up for the email list so that you'll be able to know everything that goes on around Christ Table, all the things that we're doing, in addition to this Bible study. Now, if you'd like to know more about this study in particular, we'd love to give you more information about Journey. So that URL that is right there, go.christstable.today/journey, is where you're going to find all of the information about this study. You'll find a reading list as well as a study guide that will help you walk through each and every day of this journey through the Gospel of Mark, 24 days. Feel free to go out there and download that. No email address needed, no strings attached, absolutely free. We try to give away as much as we possibly can because we're more interested in people just continuing on or beginning in their journey with Jesus. And we want to do everything that we can to make that possible for you, no matter where you are in your faith or where you are financially. Now, if you're able to support us financially, or if you think that what we're doing here is helpful to other people and you want to be a part of that, then you can either give right there at christstable.today or at that URL, right there. You can go there, purchase a box that helps us give these resources away, but also doing that will give you a printed version of the PDF, as well as a map and study guide and some other things that go along with this Bible study series. Now, today we find ourselves on day, what is this? 16, I think we finally are in this series. We're walking through this Bible study in a really kind of unique and different way called Lectio Divina. And what we're doing in Lectio Divina is we are essentially walking through the Bible in a way that is contemplating it rather than trying to dissect and nuance it. When you dissect something, you kill it. We're trying not to kill it. We're trying to breathe life into it and allow it to breathe life into us directly through the Holy Spirit. So if you'd like to know more about this way of doing Bible study, very ancient way of doing studies, then you can just Google that word Lectio Divina right up there, or the study guide that is right there at go.christstable.today walks you through that and will help you in this journey. So today on day 16, we are in Mark chapter 10. Throttling through quickly now the book of Mark because we also are coming very soon to Holy Week. So now we are at kind of the end of Jesus' journey, which is hard to believe how much ground that we have covered. But like we said, Mark moves. Here in the second half of chapter 10, what we find are several stories, and we're not going to be able to look at all of them today, but all of them are interesting. All of them are important. Some of them you may have heard, some of them may be new to you, but it's going to begin with this commentary on Jesus that we've already heard him give. And so in Mark, we see a lot of repetition of things, probably because the disciples, as Mark says, had hardened hearts. And so what do you do in order to get through a hardened heart? One of the things that you do is you just kind of continue to repeat in order to chip away at the hardness of the heart to make sure that something sinks in as you continue to chip away with the same information over and over and over again. So our reading today begins with this line: they were now on their way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And I thought this was very interesting, and I don't know what to make of this, but as I was reading through this, I was kind of thinking that it's fascinating to me that they felt the need to point out that Jesus was walking ahead of everyone. It doesn't just say that they're now on their way up to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was at the top of a hill, at the top of a mountain, and so from whichever direction you're coming from, it was up in order to get to Jerusalem. But Jesus is at the front, and I kept kind of wondering as I stopped there in my reading, why was the author here pointing out that Jesus was ahead of them? And then I kind of realized I should have kept reading, right? Context. Read what's around it whenever you don't fully understand something. And it says the disciples were filled with awe, and the people behind them were overwhelmed with fear. And so the disciples, that smaller group of individuals who are with Jesus, but we know that throughout most all of Jesus' ministry, most of these moments that we have here in the book of Mark, it wasn't just the 12 who were there witnessing it alone, but most of the time it was a larger crowd or multitude of people who was with Jesus as well. And it seems as though there is some separation here in between what the disciples are feeling and what the crowd of people who are following behind are feeling. So you kind of get this picture of this train with Jesus, who is at the front, walking ahead of all of them, then the disciples filled with awe, and then following behind are the people who are overwhelmed with fear. So Jesus, the disciples with awe, and then everybody else who's filled with fear. And I thought that this was fascinating, this pointing out that Jesus is at the front, Jesus is leading, and as you continue reading today, he's walking into a very volatile situation. He actually explains what he's about to face in Jerusalem, and it's not a good thing. So he knows that this is essentially going to become a mob that is going to really cause him physical suffering, even to the point of death. And yet he is almost racing into Jerusalem. He's in front of everybody else. The disciples, for whatever reason, are filled with awe, but everybody else is filled with fear. And I wondered why there was a difference between these two groups. And I began to think, through the process of Lectio Divina, this tension, this juxtaposition of awe and fear, these different words that are used here, and how in the same community of people, there can be a wealth of diverse emotions about any given topic in any given moment. Maybe, talking about religious situations, maybe you've been in a church where it was recognizable that in the midst of the context of that congregation, there was a very different sense among the congregation of how they should feel about a particular problem, about a particular person, about a particular event or thing that's going on in the community. And they weren't necessarily in agreement. They might have even been opposite feelings, and it split the church in that moment. It divided people from each other. Awe and fear. And I wondered, and we've kind of encouraged ourselves in this study to place ourselves in the feet of the characters who are in these stories, or to try to look over the shoulders and see them from the vantage point of when they happen. And I kind of wondered, knowing what I know about the rest of the story, which Jesus knew, would I be walking where Jesus was, ahead of everyone? Now, the others, at least the disciples, had heard Jesus say that this was a trap, that this was a setup, that it was going to be a very volatile situation that caused pain and suffering for him. In fact, he's going to say it here again. And I wonder whether or not the feelings that I have, if I were one of the disciples, would I feel awe, or would I feel fear? If I were the crowd, awe or fear? That word fear, why was there fear? They are literally in the presence of God himself. It feels as though fear would not be an emotion in that moment that we would expect to feel whenever in the presence of God. I wonder if you've ever felt fear and felt like you were abandoned. They're there with Jesus, the crowd who feels fear. They're there with God, and yet they're still feeling fear. Something's not right. Something doesn't add up. There is danger somewhere, risk about this. There's an unease. there have been moments, even as a pastor, where I have felt those things. I felt unease. I felt danger. I felt that there was risk. I felt fear. And oftentimes in those moments, I have not felt the presence of God in the same way that I do in the moments where I feel awe. And yet, I realized Jesus was here for both of them. Jesus was going ahead of those who were feeling awe, and Jesus was going ahead of those who were feeling fear. Maybe my feelings in any particular moment do not necessarily translate to the extent of the presence of God in that moment. Perhaps when I'm feeling most fearful, maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that God is the furthest away from me in that moment. Or maybe when I'm feeling awe, maybe the same thing is present there. Maybe the thing that is driving that awe is God. Maybe it's not God, but Jesus was there in both of them. And I wonder if God isn't equally present in fear as he is in awe. So there's this deep moment where Jesus explains and extends an understanding of what they're about to face in Jerusalem, which we now know to be Passover week, the death, Good Friday, the burial, and ultimately Easter Sunday, the resurrection. It feels like there are things that are appropriate to discuss or say in the context of hearing something like that from someone. And it feels like there aren't. A few days ago, Sally and I were renting a car, and the person behind the counter was talking about a story that's right now been happening in the news in Nashville about a missing college student. And she was relaying that story, and we were in the Nashville airport, and she was then relaying a story about how her own child had gone missing 6 years ago and hasn't yet been found. So whenever a lady who's on the other side of a counter from a pastor shares something that's going on in the local news that she is feeling distraught and distressed over, and then shares the connection with her own life as to why she's feeling distressed, there are appropriate ways to respond to that, and there are ways that are probably inappropriate to respond to. It was midnight. I was tired. I had been traveling all day and was looking at another 3.5 hour drive back here to Birmingham. I was not in a place where I was going to be able to provide excellent pastoral counseling in that moment. And I don't think that she necessarily really needed it. What she truly didn't need was for me to just simply ignore it and say, I'm sorry, that has nothing to do with this reservation. Could you please take care of this reservation for me? Yes, I've just heard what you've said about this local person and your son who's been missing for 6 years, but I'm just here to rent a car, honey. That's not pastor or otherwise an appropriate response in that moment when someone has shared a human moment with you. And yet, right after Jesus has done this, two of his disciples, James and John, yeah, Jesus, we know that we're on our way to Jerusalem and the people behind us are really scared. Lots of fear that's going on there. But when you sit on your glorious throne, since we're kind of talking about the end of all things, we want to sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and the other on your left. And James and John, these brothers, are jockeying for positions of authority, positions of great respect. Probably not the moment to do it after Jesus has done that, but probably there's not any moment to do that, right? Because there are 10 other disciples who are right there who are hearing you do this, jockey for a position among the rest of them. and are probably going to be upset. In fact, the text, you're going to see the response as you read the text today. And I wonder how many times I've done that. I may have done the better thing at the rental counter in the Nashville airport, but I wonder how many times in this "Is it I, Lord?" Whenever Jesus is sitting the Last Supper, which he will be very shortly from here in this text in front of us over the next few days, and he says, "One of you is going to betray me, one of you 12," he says, and all of them look around at each other and then look around back to Jesus and are like, "Is it I, Lord? Is it I, Lord? Is it which of us are going to do this?" And when I read things like, James and John kind of putting up this opportunistic moment in the middle of a very emotional and charged statement from Jesus, I think to myself, I wonder how many times I've done that. Is it I, Lord? Am I James? Am I John, who's sitting there saying, "Yeah, Jesus, I look at the world around me and all of these things that are going on, the people that you've put into my path, that I need to be your hands and your feet in caring for and showing them your love. But I got this, and this, God, that can we really talk about those things right now rather than this person who is in desperate need in this very moment, or who needs to see some love or feel some empathy?" But Jesus, I've been praying about this thing for a long time. I'd really like to have it answered. That new house, that car, that relationship with that individual that I want to notice me. I wonder how many times is it I who are James and John? Is it I who am more concerned about something that benefits me, even if it's at the expense of somebody else? And isn't this kind of what's going on here on the surface? At least some, is that James and John are more concerned about something that's going to benefit them in this moment than they are something that ultimately is going to benefit them more in the end, what Jesus is about to walk through. And oftentimes I think that this is what happens whenever we become selfish. We're doing things that benefit us, and we miss the things that ultimately would have benefit us even more had we not been looking out for number one the whole way through. So Jesus says in response to James and John, "Are you blanking kidding me? You don't know what you're asking for. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I'm about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with a baptism of suffering that I must be baptized with? Do you have absolutely any idea what I'm about to go through and what the ramifications are of the question that you're asking to be able to be granted that status? What you have to go through to get there?" "Oh, yes, we understand. We're able, Lord. We're able. We're in." And a lot of times James and John are given a bad rap for this answer. And I'm not going to say that they shouldn't receive a bad rap for this answer, for saying, yes, they can drink from the bitter cup of suffering like Jesus is about to drink from. And probably they should. But also, I was looking at this and reading it, and I stepped back from it, and I was like, well, maybe actually they are able to drink from that. They've been walking with Jesus 3.5 years now, right? Like, they've heard everything, they've seen everything. They are going to watch him suffer, and they themselves are going to suffer. And if you play the story out through the New Testament, they actually continue to suffer. And if you read the stories, at least from church history, about James and John and what happens to them and their ministry life later after the close of the New Testament story and how they die, history tells us that they and all of the disciples truly did suffer. So oftentimes I think maybe when preachers like me read this text, we kind of bag on James and John and say, well, no, they weren't able to do it. And that's a decent reading of this. It really is. But also there is a reading of this that says, well, maybe they were right. Maybe they are. Now, maybe if they truly knew what that suffering looked like, maybe they would have said, no, we can't. But here they're actually saying they are, and they actually do drink from suffering. Not the same cup of Jesus, but they drink from a ton of suffering. Many of the disciples were crucified. Many of them were tortured in similar ways that Jesus was. And so I think as I walked away from this text, I was kind of thinking, they might have been a little naive or a lot naive. They might have been doing it out of the wrong heart attitude for the wrong reasons, for asking the question. But were they right or were they wrong in their ability to suffer and their willingness to say that they would suffer? That they were that aligned and with Jesus that they thought that there's nothing that they could not endure or no place that they would not or could not go for Jesus. That they were all in. Naive, yes. Probably unable, certainly to endure what Jesus may have endured, perhaps. But were they right or were they wrong? Well, as you read the text today, I hope that you will look at this, look at these stories, look at Jesus' answers, look beyond what I've said and what I've stated and the questions that I've asked. Form your own questions, form your own answers, engage the text with your own imagination in context with the Spirit of God, and see what is spoken to you. I'll tell you, if you'd like to download that study guide, that resource, go ahead and visit the URL right there, go.christstable.today/journey. It's absolutely free. It'll help you walk through today's study. And until tomorrow,